Ready? Here we go.
Different points of view and highs and lows. A new perspective everywhere you go. Open up your mind, drown out the noise, and see if this connected. And see if this connected.
What's up, fam? The mission of this Connected podcast is to connect generations and situations about faith, life, and whatever comes along the way. To not necessarily agree, but be listened to. These conversations, of course, highlight the perspective of our various guests, and you are always welcome to agree or even disagree. But as always, we hope that it is done in charity. Now, here's your host, Catholic.Dad.
Well, thanks, Tony, for not being here, but also for that introduction. Today, fam, we are back doing podcast episodes. I know we took a long break, a very long break. We took a very long break. It was almost like 40 days, almost like we took a break for Lent. And you know what? We did. And why did we do that? Because guess what, folks? Our listeners are Catholics. And as Catholics, they seem to always give up social media and listening to podcast episodes. So why create content when you guys aren't even listening? So we are back because it's almost Pentecost and we are on fire and the Holy Spirit has returned. And so what do we do when the Holy Spirit returns? Well, we get a guest from down under. And so today, fam, our guest for episode, I think 151 or 152, I don't know. Tony's on here to tell me the truth. But we have Father Alex Osborne from that place down under, Australia. Actually, Canberra, Australia. And before Canberra, correction. You know, it is very early. Welcome, Father, to this Connected podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're doing this podcast. Australia is 17 hours ahead of us. So Father is actually in the future. He is in the future, and it is 6 a.m. over here on a Saturday morning, and it is 11 a.m. 11 p.m. in the evening in Australia. So it's almost Sunday over there. And we're just beginning Saturday. So I've never spoken to someone in the future, but here we are. We are time traveling today, and today we are time traveling to Australia. Again, Father, thank you very much for taking the time to come on the show. It's something that I've always wanted to do. I wanted to talk to an Australian, and here we go, an Australian priest. So so that our listeners can get a grasp of who you are, tell us your vocation story. How, are you a diocesan or are you a religious order? And just tell us about who you are.
Sure. So I'm Father Alex Osborne from the Archdiocese of Canberra and Goulburn. Although that wasn't always the case. I was born in the great city of Liverpool, England, hopefully known to many of you who enjoy the Premier League or the music of the Beatles.
The Beatles, yes.
I think my vocation, it's hard to tell. Yeah, I was quite an early vocation. I think I first began to think about it after coming to Australia. So my family was, it was in 2004. I was 12. My family moved here, in essence, just seeking a better life, seeking more opportunities. Mum had a great uncle who'd worked and retired in Canberra. So my family ended up here. I think it was that experience of, being kind of 12 in a new city, new country, trying to make an identity, trying to find out who I am, that really got me thinking about my vocation, about what is it that God wants from me. I suppose back in England, I just sort of followed what my family had always done. Mum was a Catholic, Dad wasn't, but we'd go to Mass as a family every Sunday. It wasn't until coming to Australia I really began to question and to see the value of it. I remember my twin sister told me once, she was afraid Mum and Dad didn't have any friends. And that blew my mind. I wasn't used to thinking about kind of my parents as people. But I thought, wow, that is so true. We go to school, we make friends. I'm sure Mum and Dad had friends at work, but they don't ever mention them to us. And I started to see the parish as a place of community. I began to see the advantage in belonging. I'd really begun to miss having my extended family, my aunts and uncles and cousins. And we'd sort of found a surrogate community in this parish. It was also around this time that I was confirmed. I'm not sure what age you do it in the States. In England, it was sort of around 15, 16. Here in Australia, it's quite young. It's about 12.
Oh.
I had something of a mystical experience at confirmation. I'm not sure whether it was a kind of an apparition, a daydream, a child with an overactive imagination, but we judge these things by their fruits. I was receiving confirmation. I was completely zoned out of the homily, not paying any attention whatsoever. I was looking at this sort of whitewashed wall in the church, and all of a sudden, in my mind's eye, I could see the most beautiful woman in the world. And she said to me, "Will you marry me?" And I said, "No, I don't know who you are, lady." She said it again, "Will you marry me?" And I said, I still don't know who you are. And then this apparition or this daydream sort of disappeared, and I kind of went back to trying my best to pay attention at confirmation. But the thought never stopped with me. What was that? What had happened? What did I see? Did I see Mary? She's kind of already got a husband. What was it that I saw? Somewhere along the lines that had planted the seed in my mind. If God was asking me to do something, it was a lot more important to listen to him than to try and do what I sort of wanted to do anyway. In any case, the whole episode had really pushed me to take my faith more seriously. So I got off to a bad start, and I stole a book from my older brother, who's now a bit of a militant atheist, so
Pray for
that mightn't have been the wisest move. I borrowed and never returned a book called The Lives of the Saints. And I read each night the life of each saint coming up. It's a wonderful gift. If you've got sort of teenagers in your life, encourage them to do the same. The saints are our heroes. They're our models. And it gets us thinking, how can I end up in this book? How can I become a saint? As I grew older, I was going to what's called a state high school here in Australia. So it's a government-run high school. It's free. There is a Catholic school system, which is, I think we teach about a quarter of all Australians. It's a big system.
Wow.
But it's also expensive. My parents being fairly fresh migrants, me and my twin sister ended up in the government school. And it was a big shock to me. It was here that I'd first come across people who didn't believe, people who didn't have any faith. Back in England, I went to a Catholic primary school, and most students were Christians. I think the majority were Catholic. Liverpool is quite a Catholic area. I don't think they took their faith particularly seriously, but they still had it. Here I was shocked, and it sort of seemed strange. My brother lost his faith when I was about 15. He said that the church was something for old women. That was his view. And that intelligent people believe in science. Intelligent people follow their own thoughts. I'm not sure exactly how widespread it is, but I thought that was so profoundly honest. A little while later, my dad converted. He'd been sort of a non-practicing Anglican for most of his life, but coming to Mass each and every Sunday had an effect. He'd had an intellectual conversion where he saw the church was something good. In Britain, I think it's kind of bogged down with so much history. The Catholic Church has always seemed to be something foreign, something dangerous. But Dad had come across. I was privileged to be able to see my father's confirmation.
Wow.
And his conversion helped me to take my own faith even more seriously. I decided to become an altar server. A friend of mine, one art class, had sort of asked me if I'd read the Bible. I hadn't, but I lied. Told them, yeah, of course I've read the Bible. I know everything about the Bible. I love my religion. Trust me. So I thought, well, I'd better put my money where my mouth is and actually read it. I started a journey. I read the Bible one chapter a night from when I was 15 till I was 18. I'd started with the book of Revelations because I was kind of curious about the end of the world. And I had so many questions. And I thought I should really ask a priest. So I thought becoming an altar server would be a good way of finding these answers. My parish priest at the time, Father Neville Drinkwater, God rest his soul, It's a name you don't forget.
That is a unique last name.
He would have been about a young, I think he was 81 or so when our paths first met. He'd often been a kind of a figure of wonder. I was still at the time of my life when I thought priests only worked on Sundays. I thought to myself, gee, that would be a cushy job. And I wondered, why doesn't this guy retire? He's old enough. He could do what he wants. But he'd be there. He'd be getting up every morning, just like Anno, early. Because he loved what he did. His love for the priesthood really inspired me. His love for his mass. It was a small kind of suburban parish, but he had a great love for his people. He'd been in the same parish. I think he ended up 40 years. On his desk in his office, he had a noose. He talked a man out of committing suicide. Even though he was quite an elderly man, he was able to just speak the truth so simply and profoundly. He really found a way to get the message across. He told me not to worry too much about the book of Revelations. He'd say it's written in a language neither of us can understand. There's some very important parts, but focus on the Gospels, focus on this, focus on that. Don't get carried away. Later on, as I came towards the end of high school, I began to see the fruits of atheism. I had no practicing Catholic friend. The closest was my twin sister. She had her faith, but she didn't really take it too seriously. I don't know whether she listens to podcasts from Southern California, but she wouldn't mind me saying that. She ended up finding work, and more often than not, she'd be working on a Sunday. At that time, I felt like I was the last Catholic young man in the world. Everyone else in the parish, they were good people, but they were old. Or kind of what a 17-year-old thinks is old. I'd become a bit more open about my faith in school. And yeah, the other students, none of them shared my faith. But they weren't particularly hostile. I was still included. I'd still be invited out to the parties. People would think it was perhaps a bit strange, but teenagers think everything's strange. As we got towards the end of high school, we started to face this number of suicides and suicide attempts. It was really shocking when you're sort of 17, 18. You're old enough to do real damage to yourself and to other people, but you're not really mature enough to know how to be responsible, how to respect yourself, respect others. Out of my friends, 5 had suicide attempts. 2 were successful. I started to think, what's wrong with me? Everyone else is having these thoughts. Why aren't I? Then it was at this moment I saw another reason why our faith is so important. Our faith grounds us and gives us hope. I'd never really come across someone who didn't have hope. It gives us hope and it gives us community and forgiveness. We can make mistakes and then, we go to confession and try better next time. But I saw so many of my friends, they just didn't have hope. More often than not, they'd make a mistake or they'd overreact to something. They'd be filled with so much guilt, so much shame, and they had nothing to do with that. I saw the wonderful gift that a priest has in absolving people of their sins. I'd been thinking about the priesthood sort of on and off since I was about 14, after my confirmation and the sort of long talks with Father Neville. I had sort of, I think when I was 17, I'd made a vow. God, if I'm not married by the time I'm 30, I'll become a priest. I'm 30 now. So I saw the tremendous benefit that our faith has. I saw that far from being this thing of the past, far from being this old ladies' social club or this sort of unscientific backwardsness, I saw that the faith, the church, provides so much good. I very passionately started to discern. I probably didn't go around about it with the greatest of maturity. But I contacted the vocations director of the diocese, who was the second priest I'd ever met in Australia. I started to attend the retreats, the sort of vocations weekends. I was fired up. I didn't have too much experience beyond my parish. And at this sort of event we'd host, funnily enough, in the building I'm right in now and where I live, the Archbishop's house, we'd have these vocation dinners, opportunities for young men to meet with the Archbishop, to journey together. And I sort of said, if I don't do this now when I'm 18, I'm going to be thinking about it for the rest of my life. I don't know whether I'll make the cut. I don't know whether I'll last the whole 7 years. But I know that I'll spend the rest of my life thinking about what would have happened if I did. I was afraid of just going and studying, racking up a debt, having nothing to show for it. So I passionately made my case to the Archbishop that I should be allowed to join the seminary fresh out of high school, aged 18. He, to his credit, took me on. I was later to find out there had been another priest who'd said almost the same thing and joined straight out of school as well. He's now my boss, the administrator of the cathedral. I found seminary amazing at first. It's 7 years here in Australia. I think it's roughly about the same. I joined for the Archdiocese of Canberra and Goulburn. I'd never really had any experience with religious orders or religious life. But I definitely had come to appreciate and love my parish. And for me, one of the wonders of being a diocesan priest is we get to enjoy the fruit of our labors. We'll be in the same area most of our life. And we'll be able to be in touch with the couples we marry, the children we baptize. For me, I think this is really what attracts me to being a parish priest, is being able to devote yourself fully to one place over a time. This seminary was in Sydney, in the Seminary of the Good Shepherd. And it was an eye-opener. I went from believing that I was the last young Catholic man. I'd met 2 seminarians on the vocations retreats. I'd assumed the seminary would be kind of maybe 10 or 15 older men, probably in their 40s or 50s. I turned up and all of a sudden I had 40 brothers.
Wow.
It was amazing. The Archdiocese of Sydney had begun to be in full swing. The new evangelization was really working. Sydney had hosted World Youth Day in 2008, so just 3 years before I joined seminary. Cardinal George Pell, who you might have, he might have made the news in the States. He was Cardinal Archbishop of Sydney and a frequent visitor to the seminary. He'd take us for a couple of courses, including the theology of the priesthood. I saw something that I'd never seen, and that was young people being attracted back to church. In my year, we had 9 join. And here is one of those paradoxes which just always find us in the church. Everywhere I looked, there was great enthusiasm, young families, new faces coming to see the seminary, giving it a try, more seminarians joining. Out of those 9 men, I'm the only one to make it to ordination. It's rare, but it's not unheard of. Normally in a seminary, you expect about half of them will be ordained, half of them will sort of discern out. And that's a very good thing. You want a seminary that actually challenges people. If everybody got ordained, could be a problem. But if people go there and they're receptive to the Holy Spirit, they're able to see the greatness of the priesthood and then say, nah, this isn't for me. God is calling me to something else. It's always better for that man to do the will of God rather than sort of the will of his peers or what he thinks the church may or may not need. The answer for what the church needs is always going to be a heart that listens to what God is asking of us. I sometimes characterize seminary as kind of being like the seasons of a year. The first 2 years were great. It was springtime. Lots of new growth. I'd experienced, sort of come to build friendship, experience Catholic friendships, men my own age. It was exciting. But there was also great drama, the storms of spring. I'd never heard of a charismatic or a traditionalist before. I'd never really come across disagreement in the church, and it was fascinating to see these arguments. A little disappointing to see the fervor with which some people enter into them. We'd also have our great moments of vocational doubt and despair. When I was 18, I had to learn how to be a man as well as learn how to be a priest. That's maybe a benefit to having a bit of maturity behind you before you join. In many ways, I always felt like I was catching up to the older fellas. Most seminarians seem to join around the age of kind of 21, 22, or 23, usually after university and maybe a couple of years in the work. I'd have great personal doubts as I'd come to maturity, come to realize what it is to be an adult. I'd sometimes think I was just a stupid teenager, following this kind of mad dream. I'd worry that I'd just been carried away with stories of the saints. I'd think I wasn't doing something sensible, something practical. I'd worry that I didn't have the strength of character to carry it on to the end. Or I'd worry that the others just seem to get these points of philosophy that I don't seem to know. In all of that, though, when we struggle and when we're open with our own faults and sort of failings, it's in our vulnerability, it's in our weakness that God speaks to us. I was maybe ready to leave the seminary, maybe a total of 11 or 12 times. I was ready to pack my bags and go. More often than not, it was just a particularly tough essay or something, and I had kind of procrastinate by having an existential crisis. It's the dangers of philosophy on a young brain. Or I'd have intense moments of self-doubt. But in all of that, I'd be humbled. And I tell you what, I was the worst altar server they ever had in the seminary. My 81-year-old parish priest, back in my home parish of Charnwood, he'd celebrate Mass on this sort of medical stool because he'd pass out if he stood on his feet too long. I'd learnt that serving at his Masses was not necessarily what happens when you're serving for an archbishop or at a cathedral. I was quite a worrisome and kind of not quite a negative personality, but I'd overthink, or I'd be a slow thinker. If you know your medieval personality types. Phlegmatic, melancholic. A friend of mine told me, Alex, if you're ever in doubt, if you're ever unsure, and my friends were certain I'd be kicked out of the seminary for just being the worst altar server in the world. If you're ever unsure, just bow. It was the worst thing he could have ever told me. At 6 a.m. in the morning, I was never sure of anything. A priest would look at me and I'd bow. I almost killed the rector of the seminary with a thurible.
Oh no.
A friend, well, I don't know if he is a friend or not. He'd criticized my technique. In the seminary, altar serving is like competitive sports. We take it very seriously. He'd criticized my technique. He said it was distracting. He said I was chicken winging. And I was trying to incense the rector of the seminary, the priest in charge. The whole time I was looking at my elbow to figure out what chicken winging was or looked like. And I looked up to see that I'd trapped the rector in front of the presider's chair. He had this look of absolute horror, both of his hands in front of his face. The thurible was swinging centimeters before his chin. This is probably a big cultural difference between Australia and America. In Australia, we like to laugh things off. The rector stopped mass and sort of looked around and said, "Did you all see how close that was?" And then the first year director came up to me the next morning and he said, "Well, Alex, you're a lucky man. They think it was an accident." Gee, I had some awful episodes in this. I sort of don't know whether I should say these things on a podcast or not. I set my bathroom on fire by accident.
How did that happen?
It was Father's Day. All the other guys from my first year had gone home and had this terrible cold. I was taking medication for this cold out of this polystyrene cup. And after taking the medicine, I sort of tore up the cup. I was 18, I was sick, I was on my own. I tore up the cup, threw it into the toilet. I was too lazy to put it in the bin. Flushed the toilet, and the polystyrene floated, didn't sink. A challenge had been set in my mind. Thought, well, I'm not going to get in there. It was clean. Thought, how am I going to fix this problem? I'll try and melt it. If I melt the polystyrene, surely it'll become a liquid and then it'll flush. I was striking long-handled match after long-handled match, trying to melt this polystyrene. That wasn't working. So I got bored and I poured half a bottle of aftershave into the toilet to get it going, and accidentally made napalm.
Oh.
That got me into some trouble. I think I could talk about seminary and seminary adventures for a long time. all that I can really say is that I probably deserved to be kicked out a few times. I thank God for the mercy that the formators showed me. Every time that they said, he's really young, or his heart's in the right place, but he's just kind of acting stupid, they had the patience and the forgiveness that had sort of allowed me to grow. I made some of the best friends I've ever had in my life in that seminary. The brotherhood was just on another level. The education, too, I've got to say, was phenomenal. My friends who went and studied in Rome, in Australia, if our seminarians get sent to Rome, they study with yours at the North American College. We don't have enough seminarians down under to have our own college yet. One of these days, it'll happen. I wasn't 100% certain of my vocation until my 5th year in seminary. I'd sort of toed and froed a little bit, or I'd question myself too much. I'd say, do you love your formation? Do you love your education? Or do you love the church, but are you sure you're going to serve her as a priest? The thought would always come back to me as well. I'd have these sort of vivid images of holding the Eucharist in my hands for the first time. Or I'd think, what would be best, to hold the body and blood of Christ, or to hold my own flesh and blood, to hold my firstborn son for the first time? If I worry that I'm not good enough for the job, wouldn't it be better to serve God in some other way? I'd have these doubts, and I'd always take it to prayer, take it to spiritual direction, and I'd just kind of say, well, soldier on, you're still young. At the end of the day, if you're sort of very well formed and you leave seminary, you're still young enough to find other work. It wasn't until I had my first long parish placement. I went to the, I don't know if you know your geography of Australia. Is it something that most Americans would know?
Which one?
Have you heard of New South Wales?
Well, I know New South Wales because I love geography, but I think most Americans don't know where parts of the states are.
All right. I'm no better at my American states. It's British counties that are the hardest. The Archdiocese of Canberra and Goulburn is it's 88,000 square kilometers. I don't know what that is in miles. It's about the same size as Ireland or Austria. I don't know my states know well enough to approximate.
The size of Illinois.
All right. And I think it's probably one of the most geographically diverse archdioceses in the world. We go from the south coast of New South Wales through to the snowy mountains. We're really good at naming things in Australia. The snowy mountains, Canberra, which is Australia's capital city, and then out into sort of central western New South Wales and almost out into the Great Sandy Desert. Again, we're really creative.
That is very creative.
For my sort of first long placement in a parish, I went to a town called Young, which is I suppose it's a farming town, about 3.5 hours. Oh, sorry, 2.5 hours out of Canberra. It's the cherry capital of Australia. If you ever have the chocolates cherry ripes, the cherries most likely come from Young. I'm not sure if you get that type of chocolate in the States, but if you ever come to Australia, give them a try. And spending 6 months in a parish, I really saw the state of the church and what I began to see how I could be useful and used. My parish priest who was supervising me, wonderful man. He might not have been the best teacher. In fact, he had an awful sense of humor. He sort of would style himself as a sort of a big bad bogan. I'm not really sure what an American oh gee, I think the closest would probably be like a bikie.
Okay, what's a bikie, Father?
A biker, like a biker gang?
Biker. Okay. No, by the way, I need to make a correction. What Father was talking about is called styrofoam in the United States. I had to look that up. Like, what is he talking about?
It's a hard one, honestly. Being British and Australian. Australian English is quite different to British, and I just end up with strange words for different things. I found that the parish placement, in many ways, it didn't go well. Most of the time, I had no idea what to do. The parish looked after, I think it was 8 or 9 different churches in the one parish, looked after by 2 priests and a retired priest. With a young assistant priest. I didn't really see much of him. I found that these priests were so busy. I wanted to be busy, but I didn't really know how. I didn't know how to work. So I'd sort of end up talking to people, trying to do things, not really getting off to the best start because I didn't know what I was doing, and then trying my best to keep up. It was tough. I was worried that I was getting a really bad reputation. Not only had I almost killed the rector and almost set the whole bathroom on fire, but this parish priest was sort of telling the seminary, "Oh, Alex doesn't know what he's doing. Alex isn't really useful to me." It was after that placement, and the staff put the pressure on, sort of saying, you're in your 5th year now. Do you know how to be a priest or don't you? In fairness, it's kind of their job to teach me. And I was very young, but all of a sudden, I had this great message in my heart and in my mind. If something is worth doing, it's worth doing it badly. This parish, which is, I think it was something like 10,000 square kilometers of territory, bunch of kangaroos and cattle, not too much else. They have this sort of love him or hate him kind of priest with a big attitude. And they were kind of 50-50 on whether they loved him or hated him. I saw the dire need that we had for priests. And I saw this whole mission, it's not about whether I'm up to the job, whether I've got the answers. It's about whether the people need a priest or whether they don't. It's seeing the need that people have. So I really thought, well, if I'm not good enough, Lord, make me good enough. I had this great moment of surrender, where I just sort of made peace with my own failures. I made peace with my own embarrassment. And I just had this great reassurance that I'll be there. I'll keep the lights on. I'll hold the line. I might not be the best, but if something's worth doing, it's worth doing it badly. I'll try to give the people what I can. And all of that is what God gives me.
That's interesting, Father, because you're what, 23, 24 at that time?
Yeah, so I think sort of on a purely worldly view, you can kind of see 23, 20, I think it was 22, 23. Not a lot of experience. It's only natural that he wouldn't know how to do the job, because he'd only sort of had a month here, a month there, working in this, working in that. But I took those failures so much to heart. And then to just know that, well, Christ takes our failures to his heart. He takes our inadequacies. And he still died on the cross for us. The seminary ended up sending me on another parish placement, and it went great. I found such resolve that I am needed. It's not about whether I'll be good enough for the job. It's just whether God is calling me. I'd come across the image of Mary. Mary is image of the church. And that made this sort of apparition or daydream that I had back when I was 13 make sense. The church is looking for her husband, and her husband, the bridegroom, is Christ. The priest stands in Christ's place, unworthily. There's a wise old priest in our, not all that old, but a wise middle-aged priest in our diocese who always says, it's not about whether your faith is strong enough to have you become a priest, but whether you are weak enough to become a priest. St. Paul says something so similar. that he'll only boast of his weaknesses. It's our vulnerability that we make a space for Christ to speak. We don't understand how it is that he saves us until we understand what it is to be wounded. I somehow managed to get myself called to orders. There've been furious phone calls. The rector of the seminary had said that he would not ordain me. Yeah. Others I needed, in the end, my spiritual director sort of took his place. I had a year after seminary living in a parish just to gauge whether my maturity was sufficient to receive ordination, to gauge as well, I suppose, whether my discernment had been secure, and it couldn't hurt to have a couple of priests watching over me. It was one of the happiest years of my life. I wasn't too far away from my parents. I was in the same part of Canberra. I was able to sort of go visit the schools, get involved with the youth. We had a youth minister, one of my best friends. She's a paramedic now. This will be a good Australian thing. She recently delivered a baby on the side of the road. She's a paramedic out in the outback. Getting out of the seminary and into sort of real life ministry, seeing the real work that's out there really confirmed so much of my own vocation. I was ordained a deacon November 2018, and then I was assigned to my family's parish, where my inspirational parish priest was 93 years old. Wow. And still going. And my bishop had told me he's getting too old to do the job and he really needs to retire, but I don't want to force him out. So let's see what having a young deacon with him will do. And it was incredible. I didn't live with him. I lived in a parish kind of 5-10 minutes drive away. But it was so good to be in this parish where I'd found my faith. I'd found, I'd first felt the call. It was incredible to see my parents there going to mass. My twin sister, I'd prayed every day that she'd marry a good Catholic man. And she had. One of my best friends, my brother-in-law, she just had her first child, and they were in the parish too. It was beautiful. Father Neville was such a character. I don't know what he was bribing his doctor with, because we don't get paid much, no matter what the religious orders tell you. He still had his driver's license, and we had to do all sorts of things. I had to break into his car and take the battery out, because I kind of wouldn't trust him to walk across the street, let alone drive. He had a heart attack on the altar in the middle of a children's mass. It was terrifying. I was giving communion. He was too frail to give communion, so he'd celebrate the mass and then sit and pray. Giving out communion, and then I just had this thump. And I could see teachers panic. Someone called an ambulance. And then I I had to keep on going. I tried to finish, kind of give the final blessing afterwards as Father Neville was brought out on a stretcher. He spent 6 months in the hospital, and I had to run the parish with the help of Sister Colleen, a wonderful retired nun now, an old friend, who really, I should say here, if it wasn't for Sister Colleen, I don't know that my family would have had the faith, and I don't know that I'd be here before you as a priest. I think the temptation for us young ones is to be caught up. In my generation, John Paul II was my hero, and he still is. I'd heard little bits and pieces about this new evangelization. It was my dream to go to World Youth Day, and I still haven't gone. I think it's a great temptation for us to assume that this new movement, and there's a new movement every generation, that it's all down to us, when really we don't deserve a lot of the glory. Most of the time we just turn up to Mass and we're passionate about it. There's two people three people in particular I truly owe my faith to. Firstly, my maternal grandmother, who I never met. She died of lung cancer when my mum was a teenager. But she'd impressed upon my mum the importance for going to Mass. She'd given my mum that faith. Mum had sort of become somewhat lapsed or lukewarm. And then when the time my older brother was born, she went to get him baptized, and she went to this old Irish priest in Liverpool. And he said no. He said, I haven't seen you around here. You call yourself a Catholic? I've never seen you at Mass. In the north of England, we take these things which others might see as offensive or hostile, and we somehow take it as a good-natured reminder. And it worked. Mum had thought, well, that's very true. I haven't been living as a Catholic. I'd better do it. He made Mum go to Mass every Sunday for 6 months before he baptized my brother. And Mum's been to Mass almost every Sunday since. And then when we moved to Australia, the temptation could have easily been, we're a young migrant family. Dad's not a Catholic, he doesn't need to come to Mass. Us children were getting towards the age where we didn't know what we were throwing away, but we could have said, we can think for ourselves. Mum still, when I say mum, I mean, as you Americans say, mom.
Yes.
Not sure if that's clear. Yeah, Mum had made the effort to find a parish. And then Sister Colleen been looking around and thought, who is this family? I've never seen them before. She went out of her way to introduce herself, to make us welcome, and to give us responsibilities. She sort of, Mum used to wait in the car until sort of 5 minutes before Mass would start, just in case Sister Colleen was there, because she'd give Mum a job. And my mum doesn't like being center of attention. So I hope she doesn't listen to podcasts either. Sister Colleen went out of her way to kind of find my family. She'd realized Mum was the Catholic, to try and get Mum a job to do, to try and find a way for Mum to connect. She more or less forced Mum into this thing called family groups, which was amazing for us as a migrant family. We were so disconnected. Mum's uncle, who'd been our ticket to Australia, he was a retired man in his mid-80s. Having this family group gave Mum and Dad a community, and it sowed the seed for our faith. So I really do have to give a big shout out to Sister Colleen and to every insistent nun out there, to every fairly aggressive parish welcomer. Your work is fruitful. You're doing the Lord's work. So I'd ended up as deacon and then sort of kind of managing the day-to-day affairs in the parish, doing communion services, trying to organize priests for the weekend masses. Did a lot of preaching. It was a lot of fun. And it was amazing to see the parish grew. A priest mentor of mine always says there's three things that people want in a parish: good community, good preaching, and good music. I could try and do two of those. I was banned from singing in the seminary. Just finding the little efforts that we'd put in and looking at things from a fresh perspective. In my homilies, I was a bit of a nervous preacher at first. It's so hard. If you take your preaching seriously, it's hard to know your congregation. I'd only been in the parish. I was only in the parish all about 9 months. You don't really get to journey with people a lot. You can get a bit of an idea, but it's hard to know people well enough to know what message to give them at what time. In Australia, Australia is the most multicultural country in the world, by the way. I think 30% of Australians were born overseas. More than half of us have got one parent who was born overseas as well. We are we're a nation of migrants. Mm-hmm. Canberra is the capital city. We've got all sorts of diplomats. We've got all sorts of people, migrants come here to work. We're a bit of a university town of lecturers, professors, students, nurses, doctors. The public service is very steady work, so it's attractive to sort of young families. It's a very cosmopolitan, multicultural place. It's very hard for preachers. We don't know where everyone's coming from. It's hard for us to understand our congregation. In the countryside, it might be a bit easier when most of them have kind of lived in the area most of their life. In the suburbs and cities, and the country is changing too, it can be so hard. There was a funny story. There was this, we always look for friendly faces in the congregation. I was a nervous preacher. There was an amazing parishioner, Paulie. She was the most active listener in the world. Bright-eyed, expressive. She sat 4 pews from the front. She'd laugh at all of my jokes. But next to her, there was this elderly Sri Lankan man who was always just stern and solemn. And I thought to myself, if I do one thing in this parish, I'm going to make that man smile. No matter what I do, no matter what I say, I just get no response from him. I could preach on hell, doesn't faze him. I could speak from the depths of my heart about love. He's not interested. I could give the most articulate, interesting, unheard of before teachings. Doesn't seem in the slightest moved. 1 month before I left the parish, I cornered him after Mass. I shook his hand and he said, "I don't speak English." I thought, oh, what a waste of energy. It can be so hard for us to know what is on our congregation's heart. If you want to help your priests, laugh at our jokes. That's really helpful. But also open your heart. Let your priest know what's on your mind. It's a hard thing to do because we can't use information from the confessional. And you don't know who's talking to you. If you really want to help your priest, have him over for dinner, lunch, or a coffee and talk to him about your life. Talk to him about your hopes and dreams. Give him a sense of who you are, what your community is. Another big problem we have is we don't know who knows each other in the parish unless they hang back and talk straight away after Mass. So such a happy parish. And then I was moved, ordained a priest. It's amazing. The whole day of my ordination, our ordinations are normally on a Friday evening so that the priests from the countryside will have time to drive in. Some of our parishes are about 5-6 hours drive away from our cathedral. I just remember thinking they will have found out something, or some letter will have come from the Vatican. You can't ordain Alex. He's just cursed. Strange things happen to him. He sets bathrooms on fires. He went through a phase of every marriage preparation meeting I had. The marriage couples the couples would break out in tears. I was worried that there'd be something. I think we always just feel inadequate of the gift. That's a great sign of genuine and true love. When we feel like we don't deserve it, when we feel like we're an idiot who's just somehow made his way into the best job in the world. It wasn't until I heard the music start playing at my ordination that I thought, wow, this is really going to happen. And I felt again in my heart those words. If something is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. You just try your best, Alex. My first parish was a bit of a wild...
Were your parents present at your ordination?
They were. It was a wonderful, wonderful event.
And your
I had family come from England as well. My militant atheist brother and his wife came along. They'd been married the week before. His Grace was so kind as to ordain me around the same time, so my grandmother could come and see it from England. I don't have a lot of Catholic relatives, but the one Catholic side of my family did come and were present as well. My twin sister and her husband brought down the gifts at the offertory, carrying with them my 1-year-old niece who wouldn't stop crying. It was a beautiful, and the cathedral was packed. I was so blown away. I didn't realize, and I'm not saying this to sort of make myself sound big or important. I honestly, I think that I'm a fool for Christ. I think that I think I've stumbled into the best job in the world. The cathedral was full. I'd been in Canberra for 2 years, or just going on. I'd really gotten involved with the schools. I'd gotten involved with the youth ministry. I was blown away by just how many people turned up to my ordination. Parishioners, even people I hadn't met, but they'd heard that a priest was being ordained. It really was overwhelming. I think there was about 850. I was blown away. As I said, though, the ordination was late in the evening. I didn't get a chance to eat anything.
Oh, no.
Spent all night giving first blessings to this 800 large crowd, but it was worth it. I went back to England. As a seminarian, you don't really get much in the way of money. I'd saved up a bit of money. I hadn't been back to England since high school, and I went to see my family and relations as a priest. Speaking of the sort of strange episodes and incidents that we get into, one of my cousins was living in Paris, France. She was working as a translator. We'd ended up going out to a pub, as the English do. When we were on holiday, we went to an English pub. We won a trivia competition. I think it's because the competition was in English and everyone else was French. But we'd ended up with sort of a few celebratory drinks. There's this sort of young man sort of ended up chatting up my cousin, and then he started to just sort of look at her the whole night through the bar. You call them bars, don't you, in America? Not pubs.
Not pubs.
Good. And it was incredible. This was sort of 3 weeks after my ordination. We'd left the bar because my cousin wasn't feeling safe. And then this guy started to follow us. And I was thinking, oh, Alex, you idiot, you absolute idiot. You're in a foreign city. And you haven't been paying attention to how many turns you've made, what street you're on, where your cousin's apartment is, anything like that. You're just carried away. And we're trying to evade this guy. He's following. We end up going down this alleyway. And all of a sudden, my cousin, who I don't know how well-known sort of English stereotypes are in the States, but she's well and truly a daughter of Liverpool. She's fiery. And she turns around and starts yelling at this guy in French. And I think to myself, oh no, what's going to happen here? I don't speak French. I can't understand what's going on. And I'm just watching their faces. And I see my cousin's face from fury and anger change to fear. And I think, oh no, what's going to happen? I thought, well, if this is going to be a bad situation, Alex, you've probably got to take the initiative. So I swung as hard as I could, clocked this guy straight on the nose. Me and my cousin ran. I just thought to myself, what have you done? 3 weeks ago, your hands were anointed with the holy chrism of priesthood, and here you are fighting in an alleyway. My cousin works as a translator for a French legal company. She said that in France, I acted in self-defense. I didn't know that at the time. I had to fly from Paris to Rome. And I thought, oh no, they're all in the EU, I'll be deported. So I thought, look as different as you could coming in. Take out your contact lenses, put on your glasses. I didn't travel in my collar, so put that on. And get a hotel as close to the Vatican as you can, in case you need to claim sanctuary. Spent my whole trip in Rome trying to compose a letter to His Grace, trying to explain, thank you very much for ordaining me. Sorry to say I've been arrested by French authorities for brawling in the streets. I thought, well, maybe I could claim sanctuary. One of the sort of the Vatican sort of Secretary of State at the time was the former nuncio to Australia, and he was a fellow Liverpudlian. So I thought maybe he'd take pity on me and I'd end up chaplain to the Swiss Guard or something. I was terrified. Being terrified in Rome really brought it home. Again, this message, which I hope is coming through loud and clear. God doesn't call you to be content and secure in life. He calls you to be terrified, panicked, and just all that you've got going for you is your conviction that you're doing the right thing. I was so afraid for the future, so afraid for what my priesthood would be. I was sort of queuing up in St. Peter's Basilica, and I looked upon the what's it called? The big needle, the pillar, where St. Peter would have been flogged before he was crucified upside down. They say that it was one of the last things St. Peter would have seen. And I thought, this is the foundation. This is the foundation that Christ builds his church on. It's fear and the conviction that you're trying your best. Throughout the extraordinary circumstances that God gives you. To listen to the Holy Spirit, to try and do what is right and good. I think that's been the foundation of my priesthood. It's been the foundation of my calling. I've tried to live it out. It's a hard job to do well, the priesthood. I ended up getting back to Australia, no problem. My first parish was Goulburn, a historic place in Australia. It used to be the centre of Australia's wool trade, Australia's first inland city, and the site of Australia's toughest prison, which I ended up being chaplain to. I don't know whether that's because of the story of Paris or not. There's all sorts of things I can say about that. COVID had come.
How long were you?
Sorry?
How long were you assigned to that first? Was that your first assignment?
I was in there for 2 years. It was an interesting place.
And then you got paroled.
Sorry?
Then you were paroled after 2 years.
That's right. I got out on good behavior. Goulburn is a historic place, majority Aussie. Speaking of being hard to know your parishioners, being hard to know your congregation, I'm an Australian citizen, but I really don't know the older generation of Australians well. If it happened before 2008, I really have no idea what was going on. I struggled to understand their worlds. I tried to understand their history and the history of the place. But history, there's history that's written in books, and then there's local history. Trying to understand why this sort of missing generation lost their faith. Out of lots of grandparents who, for them, the major issue in their life is that their children and their grandchildren don't practice. The Catholic school was doing well with enrollments, and you can convince the school students that, religion is worth something. It wasn't the busiest of parishes, so I was able to devote a full day to the high school, and that was fantastic. I love high school ministry. Spend 9 to 3 in the school, visiting religion classes. I can speak Italian, so I helped out with the Italian class and sort of going to the school football matches. It was great, and trying to get involved, meet the parents. I really struggled to sort of see the missing piece. These were good people. They're not hostile to the faith. These are parents who are paying for their children to go to a Catholic school, but they just don't go to Mass.
Can I pause you there, Father?
Sure.
Okay. So this is a great segue for me for our next topic that I really want to talk to you about.
Good.
Fam, I want to thank our sponsors, our listeners, for listening on their podcast. We have Father Alex Osborne from Canberra. Pronounce that Canberra, Australia.
Good job.
His amazing, insane, crazy trip towards his vocation, his calling to the priesthood. We're going to go to a part 2 of this episode. We're going to split this episode to 2 parts, because right now we're going to talk about what happened after he was paroled from prison. Actually, he was not actually in prison. That was his first assignment, was in prison. And tune in for this next episode, which speaks to a lot of what happens to Father Osborne, Father Alex, as we go on, in comparison of what he's experiencing in Australia versus what we are experiencing here in the United States. Similarities and differences, maybe, but definitely I see some similarities that he's already talking about. So that's what we're going to do.
Different points of view and highs and lows. A new perspective everywhere you go. Open up your mind and drown with the noise of different generations of the girls and boys. So sit back and relax. This is Catholic Podcast. Don't overreact if these thoughts are abstract. When it's hosted by Catholic Dad, who knows what's gonna happen?
Hey, what's up, fam?
Different points of view and highs and lows. A new perspective everywhere you go. Open up your mind and drown with the noise and see if this connected.
What's up, fam? To connect generations and situations about faith, life, and whatever comes along.
Expect runaway thoughts like a runaway train. Break into conversation like links of a chain. Make a Hail Mary pass, hope this connects. Have a question for a guest, put it to rest. Live a life of holiness, lead by example. Follow at Catholic.Dad and Mini Tangled. Christ leads our way, he's the good shepherd. Pray for one another, be blessed and be there. Different points of view and highs and lows. A new perspective everywhere you go. Open up your mind and drown with the noise and see if this connected.